he laughed the moment Jasmine Crockett entered the courtroom. The sound was low, almost casual, but it held enough condescension that several people in the gallery turned their heads in quiet alarm. She paused just inside the doorway, her gaze sweeping over the polished floors and the rows of silent onlookers. The bailiff had called her name as if it were a formality, but the judge's reaction said otherwise. He clearly intended to treat her presence as a minor inconvenience, a sideshow before more important business. Yet Jasmine stood straight, meeting his eyes without flinching. It was 7 minutes before the official proceedings were set to begin, and nobody had expected her to arrive this early, certainly not the judge. But here she was, impeccably dressed, shoulders set, chin lifted. All around, people were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, uncertain whether to comment or to remain still. The tension in the air was sharp enough to taste. When he finally looked away from her, he tapped his gavel lightly, almost a mocking gesture of authority. There was a faint gleam in his eye that said this was going to be a performance. His name was Judge Bradley Hawthorne. He presided over countless hearings, sentencing more people than anyone could count, and he was well known for keeping a tight rein on his courtroom. Order was his priority, and he expected every participant to accept his word as final. Those who didn't typically faced his wrath, legal or otherwise. But this time, something in his stance suggested that he saw Jasmine not just as another defendant or petitioner but as a challenge. The edges of his mouth twitched, as if the mere thought of her standing up to him amused him deeply. The thick silence filled with the echoes of that single, condescending laugh. She did not respond to his amusement with any outward sign of anger. Instead, she walked to the defendant's table, carefully placed her files down, and took a steadying breath. She'd been waiting for this day. The tension that anchored her to this moment had started months before, in a cramped office with flickering fluorescent lights, where she had first discovered evidence that contradicted everything Judge Hawthorne had declared was fact. She had discovered documents that should not have existed, recordings that made mockery of the official narrative. Despite her quiet nature, she had spent sleepless nights preparing for this confrontation. Under the fluorescent lights of the courtroom, everything felt charged, as though one spark might set off an emotional conflagration. Jasmine could hear every scrape of a shoe on the tile, every rustle of fabric. She sensed the presence of the press, waiting with pens poised and notepads balanced on their laps. They were quiet observers, well aware that something was off about this case. The murmur in the gallery was subdued because Judge Hawthorne's gaze acted like a muzzle, but there was a hum of anticipation in the air. Everyone knew that Jasmine had challenged the authority of a man whose decisions were almost never reversed. The question was whether she had the strength, or the evidence, to make him regret his dismissive laughter. He cleared his throat, scanning the room. "We're on record now," he said, voice dripping with formal politeness. "Ms. Crockett has arrived early." There was a subtle jab in that statement, as if her punctuality were a breach of etiquette. "We'll begin as soon as counsel for the state arrives. Unless," he added with a thin smile, "Ms. Crockett would like to address the court prematurely." The way he lingered on that final word made it sound like a dare. Jasmine glanced at her stack of papers, each page meticulously annotated. She had come armed with more than just documentation. She had a truth that needed to be heard, even if the walls in this place seemed to conspire against her. She looked at him calmly. "I'll wait for counsel," she replied, voice steady. "I want everyone present when I speak." He gave another quiet laugh, this time more obviously an attempt to diminish her. "As you wish," he said, leaning back in his chair. The gavel rested in front of him like an extension of his power, a small wooden tool that carried the weight of the law. He seemed to relish every second he forced her to remain standing in a courtroom that he controlled. Minutes later, the prosecutor finally arrived, stumbling through the door with a flurry of apologies. Judge Hawthorne checked his watch pointedly, as if to remind everyone that his time was valuable and that they were all fortunate to have it. The bailiff snapped the door shut. Everyone settled into place. Jasmine remained at her table, an image of composure beneath the flickering overhead lights. The judge did not waste any time. We're here today for a hearing regarding Ms. Crockett's motion to dismiss the contempt charges brought by this court. Additionally, he paused to glance at his notes. There is a matter of alleged judicial misconduct that Ms. Crockett has attempted to introduce. He emphasized the word attempted with an arched brow, implying this was all a formality he intended to ignore. Is that correct, Ms. Crockett? She nodded. Yes, Your Honor, that is correct. The gallery remained silent. Some spectators leaned forward, waiting for the next words to drop. To them, it felt like a showdown. On one side stood a judge whose reputation for ruthless authority was well established. On the other stood a woman who had dared to confront not just the system but the very man entrusted to dispense justice. Whether the spectators were there out of curiosity or genuine concern, they all sensed the stakes. Jasmine's mind flashed back to the day she found the hidden transcripts that suggested the judge had conspired to withhold crucial information in a prior case. She had stumbled upon them in the dusty backroom of a legal archive, nearly passing them by until she recognized his signature on a set of documents that contradicted the official record. For a moment she had felt her pulse hammering in her ears. If these documents were real, then the judge had orchestrated a cover-up. Bringing that to light meant stepping on the toes of a man who had shown no hesitation in punishing those who challenged him. Still, her moral code wouldn't let her turn away. She had to speak up, even if that meant risking contempt charges that had indeed come swiftly once she raised allegations. She felt her heart pounding now, as everyone waited for her to speak. The judge's gaze was on her, unblinking and cold, his posture a silent threat. Yet in her chest something burned fierce. She was not here to cower or to beg. She was here to demand justice, to present her findings in the most public way possible, so that the truth could not be buried so easily. She cleared her throat and addressed the court. Your Honor, the contempt charges against me stem from the fact that I refused to abide by a gag order I believe was placed unlawfully. I have proof that the gag order was issued to prevent the disclosure of information that implicates you in judicial misconduct. I bring to this court transcripts, documents, and a sworn affidavit that show you deliberately withheld evidence in the Myers v. City case 3 years ago. These items also indicate that you signed a judicial order that directly conflicted with the official record, effectively silencing key witnesses. A faint gasp rippled through the gallery. Judge Hawthorne's lips twitched, but he maintained his stoic mask. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably, flipping through her own notes in search of a rebuttal. Jasmine inhaled softly, determined to maintain her composure. She understood the importance of every syllable she uttered. One misstep could hand the judge exactly what he needed to dismiss her claims as emotional or ill-prepared. He tapped his pen on the bench. I see, he said, feigning an air of polite interest. And you believe these transcripts and documents are authentic? The corners of her mouth tightened. She spoke with quiet certainty. I do. I have cross-referenced the signatures. There's an audio recording that matches the transcript, identifying voices that belong to you and the city attorney who oversaw the settlement. The affidavit is signed by a court clerk who was present during closed proceedings. She looked at him steadily. Everything lines up, Your Honor. The judge leaned back, betraying no outward alarm. Authenticity will be determined through proper legal channels, he announced, his tone glacial. Until such time, I see no reason why your allegations should derail this hearing. Furthermore, you are still facing contempt charges for willfully violating a court order. He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle over the room. If these allegations are false, you risk additional penalties. If they are true, then you're implicating not just me but the entire judicial system in a conspiracy. That's a serious charge, Ms. Crockett. I hope you understand the gravity. She met his gaze, the memory of sleepless nights fueling her resolve. I do, Your Honor. What followed was a tense back and forth as the prosecutor rose to cast doubt on the validity of Jasmine's evidence. She questioned the circumstances under which Jasmine had obtained the documents, hinting that she might have trespassed in the archive. She scrutinized the affidavit, suggesting the clerk who signed it was disgruntled and might be seeking revenge. Through it all, Jasmine listened calmly, only speaking when the judge called on her to respond. A pattern emerged. Every time she tried to elaborate on the details, the judge would cut her off mid-sentence with a dismissive remark or a procedural note meant to keep the hearing on track. It was a dance of power and interruption, and the gallery could see the dynamic at play. Each time he cut her off, a subtle wave of discomfort rippled among the onlookers. They weren't accustomed to seeing someone stand so firmly against him. Minutes stretched into nearly an hour. The tension escalated in small but significant ways. He frowned more deeply, she stood more rigidly, the prosecutor's tone grew clipped. The judge's laughter from earlier seemed to have set a grim stage for what was unfolding, a clash not just of legal arguments, but of moral convictions. Outside, the press was making mental notes, some quietly tapping on their phones to capture the day's drama. But inside, no one moved or spoke unless directly addressed. A hush enveloped the wood-paneled room like a dense cloak. At one point, the judge took a long breath, glancing at a clock on the wall. "We're almost out of time for today's session," he said pointedly, as though the hearing were an afterthought. "Ms. Crockett, you claim to have proof of judicial wrongdoing. The court acknowledges your claim. However, I find the manner in which you obtained these documents to be questionable, and I'm inclined to move forward with the contempt charges unless you can demonstrate beyond a reasonable doubt that your allegations are more than just speculation." The air was thick with unspoken words. Jasmine knew this was her chance, perhaps the only one she would have. She reached into the neatly stacked papers and produced a USB drive. "The audio file is here, Your Honor," she said, her voice holding an edge of defiance. "It's a complete recording of the meeting you attended regarding the Myers case settlement. I'm requesting that it be played in open court." A low murmur spread through the gallery. The judge's jaw tightened ever so slightly, but he forced a disinterested shrug. "We'll have it examined by a third party," he said with an air of finality, ignoring her request. "For now, I see no reason to prolong these proceedings. The court stands adjourned until next week, at which point we will revisit Ms. Crockett's motion to dismiss her contempt charges and any claims of misconduct. Bailiff, clear the room." Gavel struck wood with a resounding echo. Just like that, the session ended, leaving Jasmine standing in a swirl of confusion and unresolved tension. People began to shuffle out, the press included, but their eyes remained fixed on the judge as he swept from the bench. A few sympathetic glances were thrown her way, but nobody dared speak openly. She realized that 7 minutes or not, he had set a tone, and it was one of contempt. Yet a kernel of determination burned within her. She had come this far, retreat was not an option now. She gathered her papers, ignoring the bailiff's impatient gestures, and exited the courtroom with her head held high. Over the next few days, Jasmine found herself at the center of a storm. Reporters stood outside the courthouse, hoping for a quote. Some questioned her credibility, while others celebrated her courage. The day after the hearing, an article ran in the local paper with a headline that read, "Whistleblower or opportunist? Woman accuses veteran judge of cover-up." It was the kind of piece that ignited public debate, with some siding with the judge's authority, and others calling for a deeper investigation. Yet the official response from the court was guarded. The judge's office released a brief statement. "Judge Hawthorne has full faith in the judicial process and expects Ms. Crockett's allegations to be addressed through proper channels." Behind closed doors, Jasmine felt both the weight of her mission and the fragility of her position. She had pinned her hopes on that USB drive, on the documents and transcripts that meticulously lined up to form a narrative of deceit. But she knew that what happened inside a courtroom was often a matter of persuasion, not just truth. She needed every advantage, every shred of evidence, because the moment that gavel hit, the judge controlled the tempo. She had to be prepared for every trick he might pull. A week later, the second hearing opened with a tension that matched the first. If anything, the atmosphere was even more charged. People had read the articles and formed their opinions. Public interest had soared, and seats in the gallery were full. There were whispers of protesters gathering outside, demanding accountability. Many wore homemade placards that read, "Justice for Myers," or "Stop the cover-up." Inside, The hush was almost reverent. As soon as Jasmine entered, she noticed the judge on the bench, face etched with a look of cold displeasure. He offered no laughter this time. Instead, a dark undercurrent of threat laced his every movement. Counsel for the state was present, as was a small legal team Jasmine had managed to pull together at the last minute, a collection of attorneys concerned about judicial corruption who volunteered to help her. She took her seat, and the hearing began. The judge wasted no time. "I trust you have something new for us, Ms. Crockett," he said, voice carrying thinly veiled hostility. "Otherwise, we can proceed with the contempt charges as scheduled." One of her attorneys rose, introducing himself. "Your Honor, we'd like to present an expert who has analyzed the audio file Ms. Crockett submitted. He can attest to its authenticity." The judge's lips curled in a semblance of a smile. "Of course. Bring in your expert. Let's get this sideshow on the record." His tone dripped with derision. The bailiff escorted a man in a neatly pressed suit to the stand. He identified himself as a forensic audio specialist, detailing his credentials. With practiced thoroughness, he explained the process used to verify that the recording had not been tampered with, and that the voices matched those of Judge Hawthorne and the city attorney. Judge Hawthorne leaned forward, face impassive. "And in your professional opinion, the conversation on that recording is legitimate?" The expert nodded. "To the best of my analysis, yes, Your Honor. There is no evidence of splicing or digital manipulation." The tension in the gallery became a living thing, pressing on everyone's lungs. The judge remained silent for a long moment, then addressed the prosecution. "Do you contest these findings?" The prosecutor exchanged uncertain glances with her assistants before clearing her throat. "At this time, Your Honor, we question the chain of custody for the recording, but we acknowledge the expert's opinion. We would like an opportunity for our own forensic specialist to examine it." Jasmine watched the interplay, seeing how the judge's eyes narrowed. She thought she detected a flicker of anxiety behind that facade. He nodded slowly. "Very well," he said, turning back to Jasmine. "What's on this recording, Miss Crockett, that you find so damning?" She inhaled, recalling the exact moment she first listened to it. The voices had been unmistakable. His, the city attorney's, and a third person who never spoke but could be heard shuffling papers. "On the recording, you can be heard instructing the city attorney to bury certain affidavits from the Myers case. Specifically, you mention how crucial it is that the public never learns about the city's negligence in failing to fix a traffic light that caused the fatal accident. You also mention that a key witness's testimony should be discredited by any means necessary. The conversation concludes with a direct reference to forging a judicial order sealing all evidence, an order that would appear legal but that had no official basis." "It's all there, Your Honor." Another collective gasp moved through the gallery, though many had suspected something like this all along. The judge tapped his gavel lightly, not so much to restore order as to punctuate the moment. "If you're trying to slander me, Ms. Crockett, you're doing a thorough job. But slander requires intention to harm without factual basis. Are you claiming you have actual proof that I said these words with malicious intent?" Jasmine's attorney interjected. "Your Honor, we would like the court to play the audio so everyone here can hear it directly." His reaction was immediate. "Motion denied. The jury is not present. This is a hearing, not a trial. We will handle this evidence through written briefs and depositions. I will not let my courtroom be turned into a media circus." He glanced around, a stern warning in his glare. "We have rules and procedures, and I intend to follow them." Jasmine felt a surge of frustration, but she remained outwardly calm. She knew this game. He was controlling the narrative by refusing to let the audio go public in open court. She also knew she had one more card to play, a sworn statement from the clerk who claimed he overheard the entire conversation in real time. She silently passed the affidavit to her attorney, who held it up. "We also have this," the attorney said, keeping his voice steady. "It's from a court employee who was in Judge Hawthorne's office that day. He corroborates the timeline and states he saw the judge sign an order that was never officially filed. The signature matches the one in the sealed files." Judge Hawthorne gave a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. The reliability of a single disgruntled employee is suspect at best. You'll need a lot more than that to substantiate such grand claims. His words were dismissive, but the set of his jaw told a different story. He was rattled, if only slightly. At that point, a ripple of agitation passed through the room. Some spectators whispered to each other, clearly believing Jasmine's story. Others wore skeptical frowns, uncertain whom to trust. The judge banged his gavel again, letting the echo fill the space. Order in the court. We will continue these proceedings, but I remind everyone that this hearing is to address Ms. Crockett's contempt charges and any procedural matters related to her allegations. We are not here to conduct a trial on me. That is for a higher authority. Behind those words, Jasmine could sense how determined he was to maintain a tight grip. Yet the public was no longer in the dark. They had read the articles, overheard the speculation, and now glimpsed the possibility that one of their respected authorities might have twisted the very law he was meant to uphold. Jasmine's posture did not waver. She'd put too much on the line to step back now. The hearing stretched on, each side making motions and counter-motions. The judge methodically refused to play the recording, insisting it be handled in closed depositions. He repeatedly tried to steer the conversation back to the contempt charges, as though Jasmine's allegations were merely a footnote in the official record. But the tension in the gallery spoke volumes. No one there believed that these revelations were minor. They were the stuff of scandal and cover-up, and everyone sensed the looming confrontation that was building toward a crescendo. When the session finally wrapped up, Judge Hawthorne glanced at Jasmine one more time before adjourning. His gaze was iron, laced with a silent threat. We will reconvene in 1 week. At that time, I will rule on the defense's motion regarding the validity of the evidence. Ms. Crockett, if you have anything else to present, you'd best have it ready. Court is dismissed. He stood, robe billowing behind him as he strode out, the aura of authority clinging to him even as a wave of hushed discussion erupted. Jasmine exhaled, feeling the adrenaline recede. 1 week to gather more evidence, 1 week to prepare for the possibility that he might crush her case through sheer procedural might. She could hear reporters calling her name, but she ignored them, pressing through the crowd. Her attorneys followed, equally determined. There was work to be done. Outside, the sun was blazing, and a small throng of supporters held signs, chanting, "We want justice!" She paused, trying to absorb the moment. She felt a surge of gratitude at their presence. Though the conflict seethed inside the courthouse walls, out here, people were beginning to question the entire system. A single woman's stand had lit a fuse. Whether it would extinguish in a puff of frustration or explode into full-scale accountability depended on what happened next. Each day after that was a gauntlet of research, late-night strategy sessions, and interviews with potential witnesses. Jasmine's attorneys worked tirelessly, scanning old case files and cross-referencing any mention of Judge Hawthorne that might indicate a pattern. They found multiple complaints lodged against him over the years. None had gone anywhere. That, in itself, told a story. Either those complaints were unfounded, or there was a larger mechanism at work that protected him. The more they uncovered, the more they realized Jasmine's allegations might just be the tip of a very large iceberg. They also spoke to the court clerk whose affidavit had been submitted. He seemed nervous, stammering through his recollection of that day. He insisted that he recognized the city attorney's voice and recalled seeing the judge sign an unofficial order. He described how the city attorney had left the office with a manila envelope containing documents that were never filed. The more he told his story, the more consistent it became. Though he was frightened of retaliation, he was adamant about supporting Jasmine. As the third hearing approached, the city pulsed with speculation. People on social media were divided. Some derided Jasmine as a conspiracy theorist, while others hailed her as a whistleblower. A local news channel ran a segment titled, "The Crockett Dilemma," questioning if she was courageous or reckless. Through it all, Jasmine kept a low profile, focusing on the facts. Her sense of purpose only deepened. On the day the hearing resumed, the courtroom was so packed that additional seats had to be added. Even with the extra chairs, some people had to stand. The judge entered, face set in a mask of rigid composure. Lawyers for both sides lined up their notes. Tension hummed like a taut wire. Right from the start, he made it clear that he intended to handle the contempt charges first, effectively putting the misconduct allegations on the back burner. He asked the prosecution to summarize its argument for why Jasmine should be held in contempt. Their reasoning was straightforward. She had violated a lawful gag order, disobeyed the court's direct instructions, and potentially compromised the integrity of a sealed case. Jasmine's lead attorney stood up, placing a hand on a thick folder. Your Honor, the defense argues that the gag order itself was not lawful because it was issued to conceal evidence of misconduct. We contend that one cannot be held in contempt for refusing to abide by an illegal directive. He paused, letting the words sink in. We have filed a motion to declare the gag order void, and thereby the contempt charges would be rendered moot. Furthermore, we request that this court recuse itself from ruling on that motion, given the clear conflict of interest. A collective hush fell over the room. It was a direct challenge to the judge's authority, a request that he step aside from a case implicating his own behavior. Judge Hawthorne fixed the attorney with a look that could have cut steel. A recusal motion, he said quietly. On what grounds? On the grounds that you, personally, are implicated in the underlying misconduct claims, the attorney replied, voice unwavering. Justice demands impartiality. You cannot impartially rule on a matter in which you yourself stand accused. For a moment, it seemed as if the judge would explode. His knuckles whitened where they gripped the gavel. The entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his response. Then, in a calm, clipped tone, he uttered, Motion denied. This court sees no conflict of interest, as these allegations have yet to be proven. Proceed. It was a blow, though not unexpected. The judge had no intention of relinquishing control. Jasmine could see the flicker of disappointment in her attorney's eyes, but he pressed on. Your Honor, we'd like to submit newly discovered evidence. A former city attorney's aide has come forward with emails showing that the official record was altered in the Myers case. The emails reference direct instructions from you, using an encrypted account. A ripple of chatter swept through the gallery. The judge's gaze darkened further, but he maintained composure. Submit these so-called emails to the clerk. We will review their authenticity. The attorney nodded, handing a folder to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. As the judge skimmed the first page, a muscle in his jaw twitched. He closed the folder abruptly. We will consider this along with the previous evidence in closed session, he announced. For now, we are here to deal with Ms. Crockett's contempt. I will not have these proceedings derailed. It was a tactic, a transparent attempt to push the damaging evidence aside, at least publicly. Jasmine fought the urge to object immediately, trusting her attorney to handle the procedure. Yet every minute that ticked by felt like an hour, the weight of official power pressing down on her. The judge then called the prosecution to finalize its argument for contempt. In measured tones, they described how Jasmine had defied an order from this very court, an action that struck at the core of judicial authority. They recommended a stiff fine and possible jail time. When it was Jasmine's turn to speak, she stood, hands steady at her sides. Your Honor, the reason I defied your gag order is because I believe the public has a right to know when justice is being subverted. You laugh at me, you hold me in contempt, but none of that changes the fact that these documents and recordings indicate wrongdoing. I refuse to remain silent because silence would have made me complicit. If I go to jail for that, then so be it. But the truth will not stay buried. Her words resonated through the room, and for a moment, no one spoke. The judge regarded her with a mixture of fury and something else, perhaps a grudging respect for her audacity. Then he banged his gavel, dismissing the day's session to deliberate on the evidence. Once again, the hearing ended without a clear resolution. Outside, the press swarmed Jasmine, but she said nothing more, letting her statement stand as it was. Days turned into another tense week. Rumors circulated that the judge was under internal investigation, that higher courts were monitoring the situation. But no official statement was issued. Jasmine and her attorneys braced for the worst. She fully expected the judge to use his power to silence her once and for all. If he found her in contempt, she could face immediate jail time, which would drastically limit her ability to continue pursuing the misconduct allegations. The anxiety weighed on her, but her resolve never wavered. When the next hearing day arrived, the atmosphere was electric. Word had spread that a major announcement was coming. People packed the gallery, some lining the walls. A hush fell as Judge Hawthorne took his seat. He looked out at the sea of faces, a stern paternal figure who seemed unmoved by the swirling controversies. Then he cleared his throat and announced, "We have reviewed the evidence Ms. Crockett has brought forth. While serious, these allegations require thorough investigation by an impartial body. Therefore, I am transferring the case to a higher court for independent review." He paused, letting the significance sink in. "However, this court still retains jurisdiction over Ms. Crockett's contempt charges. I find Ms. Crockett guilty of defying a lawful order." A collective shock rippled through the courtroom. Some gasped, others muttered protests. The judge banged his gavel for silence. "She is hereby sentenced to 90 days in county jail, effective immediately, unless she retracts her allegations and surrenders all evidence to the court's custody." Jasmine's stomach lurched. She felt her attorneys stiffen beside her. A sense of unreality washed over her at the enormity of it. 90 days in jail, a punishment meant to send a message to anyone who dared challenge him. Still, she lifted her chin and spoke in a voice that rang out clearly. "I will not retract the allegations, and I will not surrender the evidence to you." Her words echoed in the stunned silence. The judge nodded, as though he had expected nothing less. "Then you leave me no choice." He signaled the bailiff to take her into custody. As the bailiff approached, a sudden commotion broke out in the gallery. One of Jasmine's supporters stood and shouted, "This is an outrage!" Another demanded, "Where's the justice?" The air quivered with outrage and empathy. Jasmine didn't resist as the bailiff took her by the arm, but she looked directly at the judge. Her eyes burned with a quiet, unbreakable resolve. She might be headed to jail, but she was not beaten, not yet. In the hallway, the press was in a frenzy, cameras flashing, reporters yelling questions. All she could do was walk forward, flanked by grim-faced attorneys, until she was taken into a detention room. It was a jarring transition from the packed courthouse corridor to a small, cold cell. The door slammed shut. She heard the sound of the lock turning. Alone in the cramped silence, she closed her eyes, breathing in and out. She reminded herself that she had done the right thing, that any compromise now would mean betraying everything she stood for. Word spread rapidly. Protests intensified outside the courthouse. A small vigil formed for her, with candles lining the steps. Social media lit up with hashtags in support of Jasmine. Meanwhile, local media outlets questioned the judge's actions, pointing out the conflict of interest. Prominent legal analysts weighed in, stating it was highly unusual for a judge facing misconduct allegations to preside over the very case in which those allegations were central. In the isolation of her cell, she struggled with the sense of helplessness. Time blurred in the shadows. She had no immediate way of ensuring the new evidence reached the higher court. She had to trust her attorneys, who were working tirelessly to expedite her appeal. Each day, she was allowed one short phone call. She used it to speak with her lead attorney, gleaning updates. They told her that various advocacy groups had joined her cause, filing amicus briefs to the higher court. A statement from the clerk who had signed the affidavit was made public, adding fuel to the outcry. Tensions continued to mount, with the public increasingly demanding accountability. After almost 3 weeks in jail, she received unexpected news. The higher court had ordered an emergency hearing to review the contempt charges and the allegations of judicial misconduct. This was her chance, the opportunity to lay everything out without Judge Hawthorne controlling the proceedings. Word reached her that the hearing would be convened with an appellate panel, and she would be allowed to present her case in person. She felt a surge of hope, tempered by the knowledge that nothing was guaranteed. The day of the emergency hearing arrived, and Jasmine was transported from the county jail to a different courthouse across town. Cameras flashed wildly as she was escorted inside, ankles shackled, wrists cuffed. Supporters filled the steps, chanting her name. It was a surreal spectacle that underscored the gravity of the moment. Once inside, she was allowed to change into her own clothes, a measure of respect she hadn't expected. She looked in the mirror, noticing the toll that 3 weeks of incarceration had taken. Her cheeks were hollow, dark circles underscored her eyes, but her gaze burned with clarity. She entered the courtroom, this time with a sense of possibility. The appellate judges were seated at a long bench, 3 of them, each with a reputation for fairness. They regarded Jasmine with neutral expressions, neither sympathy nor scorn evident. But she sensed a level of professionalism here that contrasted starkly with Judge Hawthorne's heavy-handed approach. Her attorneys were already in place, stacks of evidence arrayed on the table. The prosecutor was also present, looking slightly out of depth in this new environment. One of the judges, an older woman with a poised demeanor, spoke first. "We are here to consider 2 matters. First, the contempt ruling against Ms. Jasmine Crockett. Second, the serious allegations of judicial misconduct levied against Judge Bradley Hawthorne. We will hear arguments from both sides." Jasmine's lead attorney began, laying out how the gag order was allegedly issued to hide wrongdoing. He presented the transcripts, the USB recording, and the affidavit from the clerk. The attorney also described how the judge had repeatedly refused to recuse himself, essentially acting as judge and potential defendant in the same matter. Then came the emails from the city attorney's aide, further painting a picture of deliberate, calculated efforts to bury the truth in the Myers case. Next, the prosecution tried to argue that the evidence was inconclusive, that the chain of custody was unclear, and that Jasmine had violated valid court orders. But they faced a barrage of questions from the appellate judges, who seemed skeptical of the idea that Hawthorne could rule impartially on allegations against himself. The tone of questioning indicated that the panel was taking the misconduct claim seriously. Jasmine's attorneys seized the moment to emphasize the significance of the audio recordings. They also reminded the court that the public's trust in the judiciary was at stake. Finally, Jasmine herself was allowed to speak. She rose slowly, hands trembling, but her voice was calm. "All I have wanted from the start is for the truth to come to light. If that means I face charges for contempt, so be it. But at least give these allegations a fair hearing, let the evidence be reviewed without the controlling hand of someone who stands accused. For too long, I have been powerless in the face of a system that protects its own. I respectfully ask this honorable panel to consider that justice cannot be dispensed by those who have a vested interest in suppressing it." Her words hung in the air like a solemn vow. A moment of silence followed, broken only by the soft scratch of a judge's pen on paper. Then the lead judge stated, "We will recess briefly to deliberate. Court will reconvene in 1 hour." Jasmine sat in the waiting area with her attorneys, her stomach tied in knots. She could scarcely believe how far she had come, from a dusty archive to a jail cell to the highest court she could reach without going federal. This was it: either the panel upheld the judge's contempt ruling and left her to serve out her sentence, or they overruled him and launched a full investigation into his conduct. 1 hour felt like an eternity. When the panel returned, the gallery went silent. The lead judge read from a prepared statement. "After reviewing the evidence and considering the procedural history of this case, this court finds that Judge Bradley Hawthorne's continued involvement poses a significant conflict of interest. We vacate the contempt order against Ms. Crockett, effective immediately, and order her release from custody. Furthermore, we are referring the allegations of misconduct to the State Commission on Judicial Conduct for a comprehensive inquiry. The evidence, particularly the audio recordings and related documents, warrants a formal investigation." A wave of relief surged through Jasmine, her entire body trembling with emotion. She was free, and more importantly, the truth was finally going to be examined by an impartial authority. The judge's power to silence her had been stripped away in a single decisive moment. Applause rippled through the gallery, subdued but sincere. Her attorneys shook her hand, voices trembling with excitement. She allowed herself a small, triumphant smile, remembering the moment Judge Hawthorne had laughed at her in that courtroom, certain she would never get this far. Outside, the crowd erupted the moment word spread of her exoneration. She stepped through the courthouse doors to a barrage of cameras and cheering supporters. Some carried signs that read, "Jasmine stood for us," and "No one is above the law." She felt a wave of gratitude wash over her. She gave a brief statement, careful to remain composed despite the surge of emotion. "I appreciate this court's decision to review the facts in an unbiased way. I maintain that the system, when held accountable, can still function for the greater good. I look forward to the results of the investigation and hope that justice is served." The days that followed were a whirlwind. She was released from jail, and the media attention only grew. Former defendants of Judge Hawthorne came forward with stories of dubious rulings and suspicious behaviors. Investigative reporters dug deeper into his past, uncovering a pattern of sealed orders and questionable legal tactics. The State Commission on Judicial Conduct confirmed they were opening a formal inquiry, leading many to speculate that Judge Hawthorne would face sanctions, possibly even removal from the bench. Jasmine received an outpouring of support from community members, civic organizations, and legal watchdog groups. She also received the inevitable backlash from those who insisted she was a troublemaker seeking attention. Through it all, she held firm to the values that had brought her into that courtroom in the first place. She had no intention of letting others define her or her quest for accountability. Months rolled by, and the Commission's investigation proceeded. Subpoenas were issued, witnesses were interviewed under oath, and the once infamous sealed documents were cracked open for examination. Bit by bit, a narrative emerged that supported her claims. Judge Hawthorne had indeed colluded with city officials to hide culpability in the Myers case, among other questionable actions. The final blow came when the city attorney's aide testified before the commission, confirming the authenticity of the emails and detailing how the scheme was orchestrated. The judge's signature appeared on multiple documents that had never been filed in the official court record but had been used privately to threaten or coerce witnesses. Eventually, an official report was released. It condemned Hawthorne's actions as a grievous betrayal of judicial ethics. The commission recommended that he be barred from serving on the bench. Criminal charges loomed as the evidence pointed to intentional fraud and abuse of power. The day the news broke, the city's front pages carried headlines of his downfall. It was a dramatic turn of events, a cautionary tale about unchecked authority. As for Jasmine, she stood outside the courthouse one final time, surrounded by microphones and cameras. She was no longer the trembling woman who had first stepped into Hawthorne's courtroom. The jail time and the legal battles had tested her resolve, but she had emerged stronger, more certain of her beliefs. She spoke plainly, her voice resonating with the depth of someone who had learned what it meant to fight and win, even against the steepest odds. "I never wanted fame or attention," she said. "All I ever wanted was the truth. Today, we have it. And it's my hope that those who come after me, who find themselves facing injustice, will remember that no matter how powerful someone seems, they are not beyond accountability if we stand firmly for what's right." A soft applause followed, and she turned to leave, the late afternoon sun casting a long shadow behind her. In that moment, the significance of her journey crystallized. One individual, armed with courage and evidence, had challenged an institution that had deemed itself untouchable. The memory of the judge's laugh still lingered in her mind, but it no longer held any power over her. In the end, it was he who wore the regret, and she who walked away free, with her integrity intact and the scales of justice tipping back to balance.